Chapter 1, Educational Psychology, a Foundation for Teaching. This chapter we're going to look at what does it take to make a good teacher? And then we're also going to look at the role of educational research in psychology, and then the different types of research methods that can be used to test those educational research theories. So what does make a good teacher? According to the book, knowing your subject matter is one of the most important parts. Most of you probably had a teacher that really didn't know what they were talking about, and you realized that they were kind of off. And then some of you have had really good teachers that only knew their subject matter, but didn't master teaching skills. And that's one of those things, another thing that needs to be done. We have to be able to master teaching skills. And the good thing about that is good teaching skills can be taught. They need to be intentional, which means they have to think about what they're going to teach and how they're going to teach it. You don't just fly by the seat of your pants. And they have to be able to use 21st century skills. We are preparing children right now for jobs that don't exist. The jobs that some of you are going to go out and get right now were not available when I was first going to school. So we have to be thinking ahead and preparing children for 21st century skills. So that means you have to use those 21st century skills. We also have to have a knowledge of the standards that go along. Right now we have the Common Core state standards, and most states rely on the Common Core state standards. So what do we mean by 21st century skills? That means that we have to know those core subjects and themes that go along with it. We have to know language arts. We have to know children's books. We just got done writing an article about that. Children's books are really important because you need to be able to suggest to students what they should read or what they might want to read. We have to have a good foundation in mathematics and science, and then global awareness. What's going on in the world? Do you watch the news? Do you listen to the news? Do you know what's going on in other countries? And then lastly, we need to have something called financial literacy. We wouldn't have had that big housing boom that everybody lost their houses and everything if people had more financial literacy. So we have to look at something about where money goes, how we spent, what our taxes are spent for, how do we know how much money we can afford and what we can't afford. We also have to know things about learning and innovation skills. That means teaching creativity or allowing children to be creative, teaching critical thinking skills, and then teaching problem solving. A lot of the businesses have been complaining that some of our graduates aren't able to think on their feet, that they want to be told what to do all the time or given exact instructions on how to do something. They want workers that can be creative, critical, problem solvers, that when faced with a new dilemma, that they'll come up with solutions. And then we also have to look at information. We have to be 21st century children or students need to be able to take information from media, from the internet, and they have to be able to repurpose that information and use it. And then we also have to look at life and career skills, like how much initiative do you have? Where does initiative come from? How do we get kids to be self-directed or show self-direction? We call that autonomous thinking or an autonomous student. We want children to be able to learn on their own. So if you look at this, it's components of good teaching. It's decision making. When we start thinking about children, we have to know about how do they make decisions. In order to make a decision, you have to have that knowledge of subject and teaching resources. And you have to be able to use critical thinking and problem solving skills. And then you have to have self-knowledge and self-regulation. The knowledge of students and their learning, not just them, but yourself as well. Like whether or not to push a student, when to hold back, when a child needs more guidance, and when you should let them go off on their own. And all of that goes on to reflection as well, that we need to be able to reflect. And that means teaching the children to reflect on their critical thinking and problem solving, you yourself using critical thinking and problem solving and reflecting on your teaching. And then there's that teaching and communication skills. How well do you teach other children, or how well do you get your message across? And then also, how do you let the children get their message back to you? How much they've learned and whether or not they've mastered a subject. So all of that comes together with the idea of educational psychology, is that we look at doing educational research in all of those areas so that we can come up with the best methods, and pass that along to everyone, because it seems kind of silly to keep doing the same thing over and over again if it's not working. So your book talks about becoming an intentional teacher. And before you become an intentional teacher, you have to be a certified teacher. So each state, country, Providence, if you're up in Canada, has its own requirements. But most places you have to graduate from a 4-year college with a specified distribution of courses. In Florida, there's specific courses that you have to take in order to be certified through a university. There are other ways to get certified in Florida. We call it the back doorway, where if you get a 4-year degree, you will still have to take specific courses, but sometimes you can take them at the district level, and then other times you can take them through add-on courses and stuff like that. You also have to do a satisfactory student teaching experience. As I said, that's with going through a regular teacher training program. Often districts will allow you to teach a year and they'll evaluate through that, or actually teach 2 years and then they evaluate you. The only problem I have with that backdoor model, when you just have a bachelor's degree and you don't have the other supplemental courses, you're using real kids for 2 years to practice your skills. Most states, state of Florida in particular is one of them, you also have to pass teacher certification tests or licensure tests. We have 3 actually in Florida. The first one you have to pass is the GK, the General Knowledge Test. In our program, you can't get into any of our education courses until you pass the General Knowledge Test. And then you also have to pass 2 tests after that. You have to pass the subject area exam. So whatever subject you are planning on being certified in, you must pass the test in that area. And then you also have to have one that's called professional studies, which is a lot of stuff that's in this class in Ed Psych. It's just general basic knowledge about educational research that goes along with that. And then many other states require the 10 principles of effective teaching, and that's the INTAS standards, and we're going to get into those as well as the Florida Accomplished Practices in just a second. So here are the INTAS standards. Number 1, by the way, all of these standards, whether you're talking about the INTAS standards, whether you're talking about Danielson's framework, which we're going to look at in a minute, whether you're talking about Marzano's teaching framework, whether you're talking about Florida's accomplished practices, all of them are pretty much the same. They're just packaged in a different way. So the INTAS standards was this interstate, a bunch of states got together and said that this is what good teachers do. They understand learner development. They understand how kids learn and grow. They wouldn't give something developmentally inappropriate for a kindergartner to do because they're not ready for it yet. And we're going to get to that in chapter 2 and 3, what's developmentally appropriate. They also look at learning differences. How kids have individual differences. It might be due to culture, it might be due to language, it could be due to exceptionalities, it could be due to socioeconomic standards, but we're not going to lower the bar for any of that stuff, or we're not going to raise the bar for any of those kids. We're going to actually keep the bar high, and we're going to scaffold, we'll get to that in chapter 3, where we're going to reach down and meet the kids where they're at and bring them up to where we want them to be. And those are by looking at the kids' learning differences. And that would be creating a learning environment, which is number 3. That you want to create this environment that's supportive, that's collaborative, that has this positive social interaction, so that kids want to come to school and that they want to learn, and that they become self-motivated. And it goes back to that idea of being an autonomous learner. Number 4 is pretty evident. It's content knowledge. We want teachers to know what they're talking about and have good content. And then number 5 is application of that content. I'm sure you've all had professors that knew what they were talking about, and you knew they were really, really bright, but they couldn't teach a lick. And that's one of those things that we want teachers to be able to motivate children to teach, and to give them that tools, like to teach in the way that it's understandable, that makes children want to learn, that it's authentic, that brings about critical thinking, that creativity and problem solving. Number 6 is assessment, that we want to be able to use multiple modes of assessment, that teachers look at their own growth, but also monitor the learning progress of the kids. And assessment should drive what they teach and how they teach. Number 7 is planning for instruction. There's one thing that I will say that all teachers have to become good at is planning. They have to plan out what they're going to do and plan out their lessons, because there are so many different cross disciplines that you can look at. You can make connections to other areas. You might throw in a little bit of math. You might throw in a little bit of history or some science with a history lesson. You have to know the curriculum well enough to be able to make those connections for the kids, because they don't always make it on their own. And that leads us to number 8, which is instructional strategies. That we have these different strategies, a repertoire of strategies that we can kind of pull out so that we can teach in different ways so that children are able to learn at a faster pace and with high accuracy. Number 9 is professional learning and ethical practice. You got to be ethical. I mean, we talk about that a lot. And this is just being a lifelong learner yourself, to evaluate yourself, becoming a reflective practitioner, but also it's that whole idea of ethics. I usually in my regular classes talk about this a little bit. There's way too many teachers running off with kids or having sex with kids. And so I say to them, you can't have sex with your students. And you might look at me and think, oh my God, I can't believe she just said that. But one of the reasons I say that is because there was a guy over in Brevard County who had sex with a high school student, and he said nobody told him he couldn't. So let me be perfectly clear. You can't have sex with your students. You can't run off with them like that guy did just recently in Georgia, I think it was, or Tennessee. You can't do that kind of stuff. There was some woman who took a kid to Mexico that she was in love with, and he was 14 years old. Right now, you might be 22 and the kid might be 17, and it's 5 years difference. Wait till they're 22 and you're 27. Right now, it's completely inappropriate. Now, is it appropriate for a student to have a crush on their teacher? Yeah, that's just developmentally appropriate. However, it is not appropriate for an adult to have relations with a child. So that's part of that whole ethical practice. Oh, by the way, my music people, I think there's a couple of you in the class right now too. Another one that happened, and this was a Stetson student, you cannot sell your band equipment on eBay. That's theft. So we also look at number 10, which is leadership and collaboration, and that we want teachers to be leaders. We want them to be leaders in the school. We want them to be leaders in the community. You are a role model. And so you're responsible for student learning, collaborating with learners, you're collaborating with colleagues, with families, with other school professionals. You represent the school, whether you want to or not. So those are the 10 principles of effective teaching. And as you can see, they encompass most everything. We're going to look at a couple other ones, though. This is Florida's Accomplished Practices, and it's just like the INTAS standards. And there are 5 basic guiding standards that go along with it, but overarching themes or principles is that culture of high expectations, demonstrating deep knowledge and comprehensive content knowledge, acts in a professional manner. You can see those directly relate to the other ones. Instructional design and lesson planning, that's all goes to planning. Learning environments, creating that safe environment for children. Instructional delivery and facilitation, that's strategies, doing strategies. Then there's assessment, which aligns directly with assessment. And then we have continuous improvement and responsibility and ethics, which is all part of that whole idea of being a professional. So in Florida, those are the ones that you have to meet, and we have actually mapped out our curriculum in order to make sure that you meet all of those. Danielson. Now, Danielson is a framework for teaching. This is actually the evaluation system that we use along with the accomplished practices here at Stetson. And many districts use Danielson and or they use Marzano or a combination of both. So when we look at this Danielson framework, you'll see that they're aligned exactly with the other ones. We've got planning and preparation, and it's demonstrating knowledge of content, demonstrating knowledge of students, setting instructional outcomes, demonstrating knowledge of resources, designing coherent instruction, designing student assessment. And then domain 2 is classroom environment, direct lineup, creating an environment of respect and rapport, establishing a culture for learning, managing classroom behaviors, managing student behaviors. By the way, classroom behaviors and student behaviors, the inability to manage them is the number one reason why teachers are fired within their first 2 years of teaching. And it's also the number one reason why teachers quit during their first 2 years of teaching. And then the idea of organizing physical space. How do you set up your classroom? Domain 3 is called instruction, communicating with students. How well are you able to get your idea across? Number 3 is 3B is questioning and discussion techniques, being able to get kids to start to engage with the idea. Then we have engaging students in learning. Using assessment, there's where assessment comes in, and instruction, and then demonstrating flexibility and responsiveness. Being able to go back and reteach something when it needs to be retaught because you figured out through assessment that the kids didn't get it instead of just plodding along. Domain 4 is professional responsibilities, and that's that whole idea of going back to reflecting on teaching. Also maintaining accurate records that you can justify the grades that you get. Communicating with families, that's that whole idea of communication with families and being that role model. Participating in professional community, growing and developing professionally, and showing professionalism. The next slide takes us to Marzano. And Marzano is very similar. I'm not going to go into the subcategories of Marzano, but there are 4 domains in Marzano, which is classroom strategies and behavior. Goes back to that whole idea of respect and rapport, being able to create a comprehensive behavior management plan. Planning and preparation, that's that idea of planning for instruction and preparing for instruction. Reflecting on teaching, so it goes back to all of the standards that go with actually communicating your ideas and getting the ideas across, and assessment. And then collegiality and professionalism, so that's the idea of being able to collaborate and get along with other people, with your community and with your parents and all that kind of stuff, and being ethical is part of being professional. So those are pretty much all of the frameworks. And as I said, it really doesn't matter where you teach or what you look into, whether you do the in-task standards, whether you do Danielson, whether you do Marzano, whether you do the accomplished practices. They all pretty much have the same components. They're just packaged differently. So part 2 of the chapter talks about the role of research in educational psychology. Carefully examine the obvious, the less than obvious questions. We're trying to use objective methods to test ideas about factors that contribute to learning. Educational psychology is all about the psychology of learning. How do we learn? And about child development and how does development affect learning? But the bottom line is it goes back to the whole idea of learning. The products that go along with this is principles. Explain the relationship between factors. So one of the things we're looking for is, does A relate to B? Does getting a good night's sleep mean that you're going to be a better student during the day? But then we're going to look at laws too, the principles that have been thoroughly tested and found to apply in a wide variety of situations. So sometimes you'll have a law. We don't have really any steadfast laws that I can think of right off the top of my head, other than in like science and stuff like that go along with that. But that's pretty much what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a law. And then we also have theories, which is a set of related principles and laws that explain a broad aspect of learning, behavior, or another area of interest. So you can have a theory that goes along with it, like Piaget's theory. And we've had a lot of laws that go along with it, like the idea of object permanence, that all children go through object permanence. Now, we dispute those laws, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in Chapter 2. We dispute them in that we say now that some children obtain object permanence at an earlier time than others. But we still don't dispute the idea that children all go through object permanence. So the theory is the child development theory of Piaget's theories of child development. But we kind of tweak what goes on with that. And there's components of it that we have, through testing, have found to be true, but our theories adjust based on the more research that we do. When we look at this, what's the value of it? Teachers actually look at this and kind of guide their practice. The educational research, the value of it is that it helps us understand better what's going on in our classrooms. And then we have to also look at the quality, accuracy, and usefulness of those theories. Like one of the things that we know, for a little while, we had this theory in reading, and it was called the whole language approach. And we believe that the more you read to children, that they naturally will learn. It's part of our natural development of language is to learn to read. And that children on their own, some of you may say, yeah, I don't remember anybody teaching me to read. It's just one day I could read. But then we found that not everybody learns that way. Even though we had that theory and we tried it for a little while, not everybody was becoming a good reader. Well, then we had the phonetic approach, and everybody said, oh no, we must drill phonics into children's head, and everyone must learn through phonics, and we got to go b-a-g, 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 bag. And we had that whole theory that everything had to go through this segmenting of each phoneme, and that we had to put those phonemes together, and that was how children learned to read. And then, but there were children that didn't have that who were able to read. So we had this whole, the theory of phonemic awareness and then the theory of whole language. And so the pendulum would swing back and forth between the two of them. And then finally, some people came along and said, wait a minute, maybe it's both. And so that's the value of continuing to do research, is that we now have like this, it's called the balanced approach, where yes, we teach phonics and we teach all that, but we still do that rich text reading and all that kind of stuff that goes along with whole language, because we realize that some children learn through whole language, some children learn through phonemic awareness, and that's what we get when we differentiate instruction. So some of the impact when we do educational research is on educational policies. I actually wish our legislators would read more educational research, because they might not make some goofy laws that they make. But it does help us in districts and stuff like that, because we do develop professional development programs, and we'll talk about some of the different professional development that goes along with that. And then we do also have teaching materials. Materials are developed based on some of the research that we do. So I guess what they're really trying to say is research plus common sense equals effective teaching, because you can't just do research. You'll probably have somebody up there doing just research, but if you didn't have the common sense that went along with it, it wouldn't be effective. So how do you do this? Like, what is good research? What is bad research? So you have to look at relevant research. And if you're going to teach intentionally, you want to formulate some kind of working hypothesis based on an observation. I've had teachers say, you know what, I noticed my kids get really, really bored, and they don't really like, sometimes they know all the vocabulary words, and then they don't know some vocabulary words. And they just don't seem interested in some of the words that the district says that I have to give them. So one of the things one of the teachers did was he had the kids, there were 5 district words that they had to do for vocabulary, and then he had them kind of interact with the text and some of the video and information that he had that went along with the topics that he was teaching, and he had them pick 5 of their own. And he really found that when he had the children pick their own vocabulary words, they tended to that they didn't know, they tended to build their vocabulary much more rapidly. And he actually tested that data. So he had a hypothesis, he tested the hypothesis, he gathered data on it, he organized and gathered his data. He drew some conclusions with that. And then he started to really do that on his own. He would actually not put vocabulary words on there that the kids didn't choose if they already knew the vocabulary that went along with it. So that was him. He took a course of action based on his conclusions. I had another teacher that had this wonderful way she thought that she taught writing. And she found, she did some research on it, collected some data on it, and found out that her kids' average, I think, was something like, she had it scored by somebody else, like an 80% on her test. And she was like, that's pretty good. She was feeling pretty good about herself. But then she read some research on different ways to teach writing. And so then she went back and did this other way that she didn't think was as fun, and she didn't think the kids liked it quite as much. But the kids all scored like a 95 on their next writing assignment, scored by somebody different. And so she realized that even though the one way she enjoyed teaching more and the kids seemed to enjoy it more, she actually had to teach writing the other way because it was much more effective. And that's the kind of conclusions that you want to share with someone else and to be able to talk about. And so she was able to share those experiences that went along with it. So when we look at research methods in EdPsych, there are, 3 different types. We have lab experiments, randomized field experiments, and then case study experiments. There's a couple more that we do, but those are the 3 types of experiments that we do. When you do a lab experiment is hard to do in education because you try to control almost everything. And we can't control children's lives when they leave school. If you were maybe in a residential treatment center where you had the kids all day, you might be able to do a lab experiment. We do this mostly with mice and rats and, things like that, because we can control their environment. We can control the temperature. We can control what they eat. We control, who they come in contact with, what everything in their environment is. So when we look at laboratory experiments, they're highly controlled, and their only variable that we're going to manipulate is going to be the variable that we're looking at. Now, randomized field experiments are conducted under realistic conditions. That would be like a classroom. So you just randomly assign kids to the different treatment groups, because that way you can pretty much guarantee that you're not like putting all the smart kids in one class and the not so smart kids in another class. So individual is assigned by chance to receive a different practical treatment or program. So let's say the girl that was doing, we'll say, a reading program. So you might give one class, you're teaching 6 periods a day, and you might give one class this one reading program, and then the other class another reading program, and the kids were randomly assigned to your classroom. So you can kind of look at it and say, if reading program A did better than reading program B, you could suggest that reading program A was better. If you really wanted to randomize it, to test it even more, you could flop it the next 9 weeks and switch the program and see if the scores in B went up, and then the scores in A would probably stay the same. The big difference between a lab experiment is everything is controlled. There's still randomized assignment, but everything is controlled. In randomized field experiments, we cannot control what goes on outside of the experiment, so it's really the idea of being random. A lot of researchers use single case experiments, and they study the treatment's effect by contrasting behavior before, during, and after application of the treatment. And usually what we're looking at here is called the ABA model. So A, we keep baseline data before we tried something, then we draw a line and we'll say that Johnny didn't called out 40 times, 40 times, 40 times, 40 times, draw a line, do our treatment, and then he called out 10 times, 10 times, 5 times, draw a line, and then we go without the treatment and we see if that behavior returns or whatever the program may be. So we're doing it before, during, and then after application. So it's A is before we have baseline data, B is during the treatment, and then C is after the treatment, and we withdrew the treatment again. So that's our ABA model of treatment. So with lab experiments, the internal validity is really, really high. You have increased internal validity because inside that we can tell you, because we've controlled everything, that that's really happening. But the external validity is really low because you can't replicate that out in the real world, so we can't send that out for somebody else to look at. So with a lab experiment, you have really high internal validity. If, rats end up getting cancer after you feed them saccharin in this controlled environment, then you can say rats in that controlled environment are going to get cancer, if they were fed saccharin. But you can't say that all rats outside, because there might be something in nature, they eat something else, or somebody else has more exercise or something like that, that confounds that finding. So you can't really what am I looking for? You can't really suggest that that's going to happen to the rest of society, because we know that everything, if you were in that controlled environment, would happen, but outside of that controlled environment, we have no proof that it would actually happen. Now, field experience has low internal validity, which means that you haven't controlled for everything, so you're not really positive what's causing it because you have all these confounding variables. It could be that some kids get a lot of sleep. It could be that their parents did something at home. It could be something else. But you can kind of generalize. That was the word I was looking for. You can generalize to the rest of the population. You can say, if you have kids like this in your classroom, likelihood this is going to happen in another classroom is pretty high because they're similar. So you have low internal validity, but you have high external validity. And validity just means that it's valid, that what you're actually saying is valid. You're testing what you say you're going to test. So when we look at characteristics of experimental research, the main points of both experimental is you got to have a random assignment, number one. It doesn't matter what kind of experimental research you're going to do. You're going to randomly assign kids to it. So then you're going to have an experimental group and you're going to have a control group. You always want to compare them to somebody who's not getting the treatment. And then you want to try to equalize the factors for the treatment. So for your treatment group and your control group, you want to make sure that you do the same things to them. So if I was doing this in a classroom, for my treatment group and my control group, I might have the same teacher that teaches both kids, because one teacher could be really happy. Hi kids, how are you? Oh, this is so exciting. And the other one could be like, oh, doom and gloom, we're never going to get it. So you want to make sure that you have those same factors that go within it. And the nice thing about experimental research is that you can suggest a cause and effect. Because you're using a control group and you're trying to hold the other variables stable, you can talk about cause and effect. You can say, saccharin causes cancer. You can say, this reading program enhances reading test scores with this type of students, that you can do that. But the bad part about a lot of this experimental research, a lot of times is a little bit of artificial because you are controlling so many variables, and that doesn't necessarily happen. That goes along with it, especially if you're doing a true experimental research when you're doing that. Not a field study. Other ones that we talk about in research methods and EdPsych is correlational study, which is to see whether or not two things are related. The variables can be positively correlated, negatively correlated, or no correlation or uncorrelated. When one variable is high, the other one also tends to be high. So going to school, not being absent, being present every day in school tends to be correlated with high grades. Negatively correlated is missing school a lot tends to be correlated with low grades. So when one variable is high, the other one tends to be high. Negatively correlated is one variable is high, so we have a lot of absences. The other one tends to be at low. We have low GPA. When they're uncorrelated, there's really no correlation between them at all. It means that you don't see any effect whatsoever. So whether or not a child ate burritos for lunch every day does not correlate with their GPA. There is some weird ones that we have with correlation, like this is actually correlationally true that when women's fashion skirts are high, stock markets tend to be high, and when they're low, stock markets tend to be low. I don't know if it's true still to this day, but it was for quite a while. And there's no real reason why, they just happen to be correlated. There's also a correlation of, it's like in Minnesota, they said that more TV watching has a higher incidence of autism. Does that mean that autism causes TV watching? I mean, TV watching causes autism? No, they just happen to go together. So when the example that they gave is positive correlation, hours of study per week in grades, negative correlation is days absent in grades. No correlation, mass achievement in Virginia is probably unrelated to achievement motivation in California. There's just no correlation there. So the things that correlational studies do, they may tell us that two variables are related, that they kind of go together. We don't know why they're related, we just know they're related. They do not tell us that they cause one another, and people get this wrong a lot. They don't cause. There's no causation with correlation. And these are the most used studies in educational psychology. We do a lot of correlational studies. And so one of this little diagram, if you're looking at it, not just listening, does student attentive cause high achievement, or are high ability, high achieving students simply more attentive than other students? And see, we don't know. We know they're correlated, but we don't know why they're correlated. We just know that they tend to go together. And we don't know which way the arrow's going. Like, we don't know, is attentive equal to achievement, or is it IQ or attentive or IQ achievement? We're really not really sure. Our last type that we talk about is descriptive research. Well, actually, there's another one after this because it's a type of research that teachers in specific do. And it really describes a situation. If you remember learning about mean, median, and mode, those are usually three descriptors that we use in descriptive research. It also can be a survey or an instrument or an interview that goes along with this. And when we're doing interviews, we're looking for patterns. We're looking for this kids saying the same things over and over again. And when we're looking for survey, we're usually looking some kind of Likert scale where we're trying to figure out how someone feels or thinks about something. Ethnography is a type of descriptive research, and it's when a researcher goes in and spends a lot of time and does a lot of surveys and does a lot of interviews, and they're trying to look for patterns in the situation. It's used a lot in anthropology. I actually did an ethnography for my dissertation, and I went in and looked at why children who are expelled from school believe that they were expelled. Like, what is the cause of their expulsion? Not necessarily like what was written on the paper, but what they thought led up to their expulsion that they went through. And so I spent 2 years in a classroom. When you're emotionally and behaviorally disordered EBD student, you can't be expelled because it's a manifestation of your handicap. So I went to a school for all these kids who were expelled and studied them for about 3 years. And interviewed them and talked to them and talked to the people that were with them and stuff like that. So when we also look at it, and probably the final one that we're going to talk about is action research. It's a form of descriptive research carried about by educators in their own classrooms. Teachers, the ones I described to you a little bit earlier that did those kind of quasi-experimental designs, that's what they're doing is action research. Teachers might try a new teaching method, collect information about how it worked, and communicates this with others about its effectiveness. Because the teachers themselves are involved in the experiment, it kind of lacks objectivity. They really can't be objective about it because they will be manipulating their behavior while they're teaching. So if they're doing it in their own classroom, it's hard for them to be objective. So that makes it not a field experiment and rather be action research. Because when you have a field experiment, you want the researcher to be objective and out of the study. Action research can provide deep insight from frontline teachers and administrators it would be impossible for researchers to do outside the classroom because they can see the nitty-gritty of what's going on. And then they bring that rich description in, and it really helps. When you want to do an action research, you start out with a good question that you care about or a problem that you have in your class. You find out what's already known about it, so you do research and you try and research what are the best strategies to use with that. You plan how you're going to collect your data, and you go ahead and collect data. So you could do a single subject case design, or you could do a field experiment. And you carry out your study, and then you interpret those findings. So when we go back and look at this chapter, we look at what makes a good teacher, what is the role of educational psychology, and what research methodologies are used. If we look at teaching, what is a good teacher, you should be able to come up with 4 examples, would be like classroom planning, professionalism, content knowledge, and assessment. That would probably be the big 4 that goes into that, and you can look at the other ones that go along with it, but those would probably be the big 4 domains that are looking at. And classroom environment, I said that. And then what is the role of educational research in psychology? It's really to come up with theories and laws that go along with the principles that we have outlined. And our principles lead to laws, which lead to theories. And then we look at what educational methods of research that we look at. And we look at experimental design, correlational design, descriptive or ethnographic design, and then action research would be it. So, one of the things I want you to remember is research plus common sense equals effective teaching. And that is the end of chapter 1.